say this New York feels a little like a calm this morning compared to what it's felt like the past week or so. So it's busy times, busy times. But let's go ahead and get started. We have 23 people here today. Welcome everyone to the November Sustainability Client Forum. As a reminder, so the topic today is how to communicate changing sustainability goals, and we're very fortunate to have Michael Littenberg here as our presenter today. Before I introduce Michael, just a few elements for a reminder for some of you who are new to the forum. Some of you are very loyal participants. Just as a reminder, we are recording the conversation portion, and today is going to take the format of a fireside chat with Michael. We will then stop the recording just to encourage conversation, because naturally a big theme of this is we want as much participation from our audience members as possible. So bring your questions. The reason that we're having this topic right now is because this is one of the primary questions that our own advisory team is receiving. And so we know it's a hot topic item, and we'd love to hear from you as well. We will share the recording after the presentation, so keep an eye out in your inbox for that if you want to come back and check on anything. And then also we have a thought piece that is in the works on this particular topic that will be shared later on this month. And without further ado, so Michael, thank you so much for joining us. For an introduction to those not familiar with Michael's work, he is the global head of Ropes and Gray's ESG, CSR, and business and human rights compliance practice. For those of you who are not on his newsletter, I highly encourage you to go join that. It's one of my mandatory readings when it comes through my inbox. And there's not many things that catch my attention these days. And that is certainly one of the elements that I do stop, pause, and pay attention to. As part of his practice for more than 30 years, so lots of experience here, Michael has been active in advising public and private companies, asset managers, and trade associations on ESG and CSR and business and human rights related matters. And he is widely viewed as one of the leading practitioners in this particular space. So we're very fortunate to have Michael presenting on this topic today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. The questions that we have today they're coming from our advisory team, and a lot of the questions that we are getting directly from a lot of our clients on this topic. So they're relevant, and as I mentioned, if there's any questions that pop up along the way, by all means, please feel free to use the chat, use the Q&A, raise your hand. This is an open conversation for us to discuss and have a chat. So Michael, first,
thank you for having me. So
yes, again, thank you so much for joining us. I did just go right into that. So if you wanted to start with any comments, by all means, please do.
Great. No, like I said, thank you for having me here. Pleasure to be here with everybody. And, and I think this is a really timely topic. It's something, we know a lot of companies are grappling with these days, especially, as you're kind of coming up on, putting out a lot of new targets. People are resetting targets, wondering whether and when they should reset targets and goals. So, like I said, I think just extremely timely. So, and, kudos to you for, having your pulse on this, because I'm sure, it's something all of your companies all need to be familiar with. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is one of those things where we did specifically want to have an attorney speaking on this particular topic, because it is something that needs to be considered with the fullest appreciation and sensitivity. And it's something that at the Labrador team, within our advisory core, we are very governance minded. It's the lens at which we look through all things. We do tend to pay attention to the investor stakeholder, but you cannot do that without looking at the regulatory landscape right now. And it's posing a lot of questions, and some are because groups are at a natural end of a target and goal cycle, but some are being responsive to what is happening around us at this given point in time. So the first question that we have here is, what information do you think companies should disclose, whether that's in a sustainability report or elsewhere, on why they are changing a sustainability related goal? And to follow that, does the same advice apply for changing sustainability related targets? So what should be said on why they are changing their goals and on the targets.
And I assume by goal versus target, goal, you're thinking of something that's a little more generalized, whereas a target is more of a hard number. So you're kind of thinking about the difference. So I guess, since I'm a lawyer, maybe to start out with kind of a little bit of the how I would think about this from a legal overlay perspective. So I think you always kind of, want to be thinking about is the information material, and how you kind of define materiality and think about that will be different if it's a public company versus a private company. Although I know most of the companies on this call are public companies. So I think, through a materiality lens, it's going to focus on how you think about, what is the timing of the disclosure, what's the content, where does it sit, and then I think also, you need to be sensitive to, greenwashing, green hushing, and in the context of consumer protection claims, securities fraud for public companies. But I think, look, I think the great news here for most companies is, very little, I think, of what we're going to talk about is going to be material, right? To big companies, right? So I think that's not to say it's not important. That's not to say that a lot of stakeholders don't care about it. But, I think there's a difference between is something, material to, a decision that somebody's making, whether a decision to invest in a company's stock, to sell its stock, how they vote, to buy a particular product. I think there's certainly a higher bar for, information that's material. And I think the way people tend to think about it also is in the litigation context. It's certainly harder, for a plaintiff to prove something's material. So the good news is I think companies will have a lot of flexibility when they kind of think about the what and the where on disclosures when they're, changing a goal or they're changing a target. I think it is a general matter. Look, the way I, kind of think about this, and I think about it more or less the same, whether it's a goal or a target is, I think it's always important just to be really clear on disclosure. So, if you're going to change a goal or a target, talk about, well, what was the original goal and target? What is the reason for the specific change that the company is making? Is there any other impacts of it? So are there impacts on the business? Are there impacts on other goals, other targets? And then, I think, a lot of times, when companies are changing goals and targets, you're not getting rid of them, you're modifying them. And so you're providing forward-looking information. So if you're a public company, I think it's also important just to, revisit and if necessary, refresh, any of your cautionary language, around those forward-looking statements and any assumptions that you're making. And like I said, look, I think, all of this and the way I think about it, it applies equally to targets and goals. I think if there is a difference, goals often are a little squishier and targets are very specific. So I think, the more, kind of specific the change is, I think that sometimes also just requires more specificity around, the contextual disclosure that you're providing as well, so that, so that the reader can understand exactly what's changing and why it's changing.
Yeah, interesting. Because the nature of the change could be different, and that's the challenge right now is if we're speaking to 15 different companies on changing goals, typically there's 15 different reasons for why would be changing their goals and or targets.
Right.
So
And I think it's important that, look, I think context is very specific on all of this, right? And facts and circumstances are very specific. So I think that it's always important for companies to avoid just boilerplate disclosure, right? The disclosure
Mhm.
should be tailored to the company, and I'm sure you guys always advise, it should be genuine, because I think when it's a bunch of, just corporate doublespeak, people see through that very quickly, right?
Yes, and the audience is substantially more well-versed and educated on these topics than I think maybe what we would have looked at in prior days. And of course, we need to look at the intake from all of our different stakeholder audiences, but the investor stakeholder, who is the one that's going to be primarily probably sensitive to a lot of these aspects from a maybe definitely a targets perspective, is going to be more informed and looking for that more specific explanation.
Well, and I think you make a good point, right? I mean, stakeholders are much more sophisticated in their understanding of
Mm,
these things than they were a few years ago. And also, I think when you're talking about investors also, at least the large institutional investors all have fairly large and fairly sophisticated stewardship teams internally. And that doesn't mean they're going to always reach out to companies on everything, but where they do reach out, or at least in their evaluation of, changes that you're making, they do tend to understand what companies are doing.
Mm,
And also, they have the lens of, they're looking at potentially 100, 200, 500, 1,000 companies. And so, I think people who sometimes think, oh, well, we can be kind of a little clever on this, recognize that, the folks who are kind of reading this, they probably are kind of following the market more broadly too, right?
yeah. And it's interesting because as you speak, one of the things that comes to mind for me is I went to a proxy season recap with several institutional investors, and one of the topics was the sensitivity around engagement with the changing in the SEC guidance. And they were pretty consistent in saying if they have questions, they will reach out, but they really don't want to have questions. They want that if you're sharing it in their disclosures, you need to do your best job possible being clear in your disclosures so that they don't need to come to you for engagement purposes because of the changing nature of the understanding around engagement and the requirements of both company and investor on that front.
I think that's also a very important point. Yes. I mean, you can't assume that if, people don't understand it, that they're going to reach out. If they don't understand it, then they just may not understand it, and then they may base decisions on, kind of erroneous information.
Yep, and filling in the blanks can oftentimes go poorly. Just think of
Right.
Mac libs.
Exactly. Which that said, look, I don't think companies, when they change targets or goals, they have to have pages and pages and pages of disclosure, right? But there's just got to be enough that succinctly explains what you're doing so the reader can understand.
Yes, yeah. So moving on, the next question that we have here is it's a two-part question. So I'll go ahead and read both, and then we can maybe digest into part one and part two. Transferring our attention away from voluntary. We're with regulatory requirements calling for disclosure of metrics and targets. Should companies take a fresh look at publicly shared goals? It's part one. And then part two is specifically California's SB 261 requires that companies disclose climate risks and opportunity metrics and targets. So we've got the fresh take on publicly traded or public shared goals, and then we have the SB 261 risks and opportunities metrics and targets. And then given the current anti-climate pushback at the federal level, what should companies keep top of mind when drafting disclosures in response to 261?
Okay, so first question, just, should you take a fresh look in light of, kind of regulatory developments? I mean, the short answer, I think there is yes. I think that, as we've kind of moved from voluntary to mandatory, I think that, one of the things that a lot of companies have seen is there's been some unintended consequences of some of their disclosures, in terms of, well, companies have said a lot about, for example, climate risk, and now they're thinking about, all right, well, now how does that kind of segue into what we want to say or don't want to say in California, or how does it segue into requirements for CSRD if we're subject to that, or Australia climate, so I think, look, I think it's important for companies to have a lot of voluntary disclosure out there where it makes sense for them. But it's certainly, we are seeing many cases that has consequences for the mandatory, right? So then, your question specifically about, SB 261 is, kind of how to, kind of think about that. So SB 261 is kind of a weird one these days, right? I mean, and it's one that a lot of companies are grappling with because it's not exactly clear what you need to disclose, right? I mean, you can take kind of a narrow read of the statute, or you can take a broader read based on all of the kind of draft CARB guidance that's out there. I think if you take a narrower read, certainly at a minimum, you have to talk about your climate-related risks in accordance with the TCFD framework, and then, the steps that you're taking to address those risks. And, if you kind of take the broader view, then you have to talk about governance, you have to talk about metrics and targets, although even within the CARB guidance, it's not clear, kind of what's a recommendation versus what they view as a minimum requirement because they're a little inconsistent, on all of that sort of stuff. I think though where we are seeing a lot of companies calibrating on this is that, if they do have, defined metrics and targets, and they do relate, specifically to their climate risks and their steps that they're taking to address climate risks, they are talking about that or planning on talking about it in their 261 disclosure. And, we've already, been involved in and seen, probably about, kind of 50 draft disclosures, from companies. So I think this is consistent with what we're seeing. I think, one of the things that, a lot of companies are, I think trying to navigate, with 261 is how much of your existing disclosure do you put in your 261 report? The approach we're generally seeing companies taking is they're viewing 261 as very much of a regulatory compliance exercise. Look, and I think it's important to, make sure all the different disclosures that companies have on the voluntary side and the mandatory side sync up and they tell a consistent, coherent story. But as a general matter, we're seeing that, companies are looking at 261 is the place to meet the regulatory requirements. And then, where they want to kind of go beyond those, that's sitting still in the voluntary disclosures, right? And whether that's, climate risks, whether that's, mitigation measures, whether that's metrics and targets, but on average, I would say most of the 261 disclosures that we're seeing, probably are topping out at around 10 pages. I mean, there are certainly outliers. There's ones that are longer, but generally, I think the view there is, less is more. One of the interesting things we're seeing on metrics, for 261 reports is distinct from targets is, we're seeing some companies putting their GHG emissions disclosures in their 261 report, and we've others that are instead just going to say that, they're subject to 253 and, they'll report, historical emissions metrics, when and as required by 253. I think on the targets also, the other thing that I would just say in the draft CARB guidance, it talks about disclosing targets where they're material.
Mhm.
So so if a company has 30 different targets that they've set, they don't necessarily have to disclose literally every target that they have out there, and everything related to climate. And they don't necessarily have to disclose targets that they haven't otherwise publicly disclosed anywhere.
Yeah, it is interesting, and we'll see. I mean, the the time is coming upon us quickly. But that
Very
is
quickly, very less than 2 months now.
yeah, and is I mean for those listening in today, you have Michael looking at it from a content perspective. The Labrador team sees it from a content perspective, and we're seeing relatively similar. So less is more compliance type acts, and just getting this done and seeing where the airplane that is currently in flight and being built at the same time, seeing where it takes us. What is our destination? So maybe a lighter question here. So do you have any advice for companies closing out 2025 sustainability goals and issuing new goals? And so those that are maybe coming to their natural end, 2025 was a popular year to say, hey, we're going to go till 2025 and then set new goals. Any recommendations or words of wisdom for those groups?
Well, some recommendations. I'm not sure if they're words of wisdom, but they're at least recommendations. So look, I think this kind of gets back to the general theme I was saying. It was I think it's just important always to be clear, right? Right. So, where you're closing out a 2025 goal, you know, talk about has the goal been met? Has it been partially met? Is it unmet? And then provide, the quantitative results, versus the baseline or whatever milestones you've set as a company. And then, also provide whatever relevant contextual disclosure, that, resulted in any variance. And then I think it's also a good idea to just, bridge to the new goals. So don't just, kind of say, here's the old goals, here's the new goals, but, how do the old goals kind of transition into the new goals? How did they inform the new goals that are being set. And then I think just to, bring a couple of legal things into this, I think that, it's also important as you're setting new goals as a company, just to think about, kind of how does that relate to, your disclosure requirements, whether that's California, whether that's places like Australia, the UK, CSRD, or other things. And then, because goals are inherently forward looking, take a fresh look, at any of the safe harbor language around forward looking statements that companies have, accompanying their disclosures, or that is linked to from the disclosures. And then also just, any, critical or important assumptions or methodologies that are important for a reader to understand as it relates to the goals and how they might evaluate those goals.
Yeah, yeah. And it's I mean, one thing that comes to mind is when we're setting our goals, none of us have
Right.
a magic ball to be able to see what the future holds. There could be very reasonable explanations for why an organization would potentially not meet a goal. Just giving that explanation, giving that counsel.
And I think it's also always a good idea, just to indicate, in whatever language makes sense. I mean, if a goal is a moonshot goal, or it's a stretch goal, or it's, something that's more likely to be achievable, or if it's something that,
Sure.
requires a lot of, kind of, a lot of, external factors, to be able to achieve, versus it's something that's, more within the company's control, right? Right. So I think it's just part of all of that context. I think it's always, you want to make sure the reader, understands, kind of the understands the goal more generally, and its achievability, and what needs to go into it.
Yeah, yeah. And we did have a question come in that I missed, and so I do want to take it back a moment because I think it's quite relevant. But any particular guidance on whether to consider disclosing qualitative or quantitative climate risk assessment?
So what we're seeing from most companies so far that we're working with, I assume this is really more a California question that's
Yeah.
being asked, is companies are doing qualitative risk assessments, or and disclosing it. Look, I think some of this is also because a lot of companies just have not done quantitative risk assessments, right? And if you're kind of doing this for the first time and you're just getting started on it, the reality is you're not going to do a quantitative assessment. You're going to do a qualitative assessment because there's only so much time to comply. Certainly, California Air Resources Board has indicated that a qualitative assessment is fine, satisfies the requirements of the statute, and also, look, I think for companies that are relatively new to assessing their climate risks, I think you want to anyway start with something that's qualitative. I mean, you're not ready to do a quantitative assessment if you're just first getting started with this. It would not surprise me if we see that, well over 90% of the reports that are ultimately published for purposes of SB 261 do a qualitative versus a quantitative assessment. The only clients we have that are publishing quantitative risk assessments are companies that have already done it and have already published it. So we're not seeing anybody that's doing it specifically for 261. They're publishing it or including it in their 261 disclosure because they've already done it as part of their voluntary TCFD compliance, and just have it off the shelf or on the shelf already.
Okay. Very helpful. If there's follow-up to that question, please by all means drop it in the Q&A there, and we're happy to follow up on that. And then jumping back over to the voluntary goals, is it advisable to take changing goals as a 1 or 2-step process? Should a new goal be introduced immediately in step 1, or can a new goal be introduced in the near future, 2-step? Step one.
I think I think you definitely can do it in a two-step process. I think the way companies, you know, announce and set goals, I mean, I think they need to do it in a way that makes sense for the particular company. I mean, I think, look, one of the issues in the sustainability space, which companies have gotten much better at over the last few years, but 5 years ago, I think there was a lot of just rah rah. We need to set, goals. We need to have targets. We need to put a lot of stuff out there just to say we're doing stuff and to have stuff out there. And there wasn't necessarily a lot of thought that went into it. I feel we're in a place now that's much better, where people are being much more thoughtful. The people on the other side of this that are receiving the information are much more thoughtful and informed and educated in their approach. So I view it as more one where, kind of steady wins the race, right? We're just doing it in a way that is thoughtful and measured is more important than just getting stuff out there for the sake of getting stuff out there. And we do have clients that, they have, um, goals or targets that are coming to their end. It's time to set new goals and targets. And we have some clients that are saying they're going to take a pause. They're going to take a year and they're going to figure out what their new goals and targets are, and then explaining why they're doing that, right?
What about in the context of eliminating a goal? It's not
Uh,
it's like, this is not a good goal for us anymore, or this exposes us to risk, whatever it may be. Like, what about in that context? It is gone and not being replaced.
so here also, I think it's important to be sensitive to materiality. If you're, eliminating a goal or not replacing a goal or a target, it's important to think about, how will that be perceived by recipients of the information? And if it is material, that will affect disclosure, that'll affect timing of disclosure, if it's thinking about greenwashing risk, greenwashing risk. Now, as I said at the beginning, in most cases, I think most of this will not be material as we think about, materiality for federal securities laws, for consumer class action purposes. And if it's not material, there's a lot more flexibility in, kind of the when and the how. My suggestion, though, always is if it's not material, um, decouple the announcement from other communications that may negatively move the market. So, for example, if you're going to have a bad quarter and you're going to put out, earnings information that's going to underwhelm the market, maybe result in a drop in your stock price, don't use that as the place to also talk about, that talk about your sustainability goals, right? Because, you don't want somebody, a plaintiff's lawyer, to draw the link and say, well, that's what, precipitated the drop in stock price, right? Right. So I think, if you can kind of, either put it out at a separate time or couple it with positive information, that's always a good thing, right? Right. But I think, you know, as we've been saying so far, it's important, you know, be clear, provide a good substantive rationale that people understand of, why you've eliminated a particular goal or target, if there's particular impacts, discuss what those are. And then I think also, where you can talk about your performance to date and show progress before you've eliminated the target or goal. I think that's a good thing as well.
Yeah. And a follow-up question, Michael. If companies should focus disclosing on what is material, do you mean SEC material? Which materiality are we talking about here?
So I think, look, I think generally for this audience today, we're talking about SEC materiality, right? That's what people are going to be very focused on. But I think, though, when you think about materiality, if you're, for example, in a consumer facing business, you do have to also think about, information that may be material to a consumer. So meaning in connection with a decision to buy a particular product, for example, or use a particular service of a company. I think that's less likely to be the case with a lot of what we're talking about. But, you know, for good or bad, we're in a society where pretty much anybody can sue anybody for anything. It doesn't really mean that those claims have legs, right? But we do see, a lot of plaintiffs' law firm activity in the sustainability space around greenwashing, around green hushing. And even though most of the time there isn't really a there, it doesn't prevent people from bringing those allegations. And, those can be, kind of very costly and time consuming to deal with. And most of the plaintiffs' firms, I think, in this area, they're really in it for a quick settlement buck, in most cases. So, so anything you can do kind of on the front end, I think mitigate that risk is always helpful. But I think as you think about materiality, if you're subject to other regulations, outside of the US, you need to think about materiality as defined under those regulations. So for example, CSRD has a double materiality approach, right? So you not only look at financial materiality, but you look at stakeholder materiality as well.
So I mean, there's been quite a bit of news in the past few days of some litigation, and I'm hoping that we can save a few minutes at the end for that. So for those who want to stick around, we're gonna have a fun conversation on some of the news of recent days. But very quickly, I think we have only two more questions. Actually, three. So as we talk about materiality, and we talk about this idea of SEC materiality, and then there's what we disclose in our sustainability report versus what we disclose in our 10K. How do you think about, and how do you encourage others to think about the consistency of reporting between their primary shareholder disclosures?
So this is something a lot of companies are really grappling with, because historically, in a lot of companies, mandatory disclosures were managed over here, voluntary disclosures were managed over here, and then maybe, disclosures were also managed regionally, by different teams or, even different business units. And so, with this increase in regulatory requirements across a lot of different jurisdictions on sustainability, it's put a lot more focus and pressure on consistency of disclosures. And so what we've been seeing at a lot of large companies is, they're trying to kind of come up with this single source of truth. And, and I think some people are a little more successful with it than others, but essentially, having a single place that you pull from for disclosures that you use for different either mandatory or voluntary communications. And I think also not only people had different levels of success with this, but also their single source of truth has different levels of detail. So some clients we work with, it's really intended to be kind of all encompassing. We have other clients that it's based on trying to align with a particular regulation, and then everybody kind of pulls from it for other regulations. The other thing that we're seeing to address this concern at a lot of clients is we're seeing more centralization of sustainability disclosures. So not meaning it all literally sits with one person, but often sitting with a core team that's responsible for all of the disclosures globally. So that you have more efficiency, and then you also mitigate risk. The other thing that we're seeing is part of that is it's very much of a multi-stakeholder team and a multi-departmental team. So, whereas at one time, maybe the lawyers and the finance professionals would have dealt with the regulatory disclosures and like SEC things, and then all the voluntary stuff would have kind of sat with a different team, and maybe there would have been a little bit of overlap, but not much. We're now seeing in this space much more cross-functional teams, and in particular, with all of the new regulations and many of them requiring at least some level of assurance, we're seeing finance kind of coming into a lot of the sustainability disclosures in a way that they didn't used to it. And I think what all of this is resulting in is, a lot better and thoughtful disclosures at a lot of companies. And with that said, though, even though we're seeing these multidisciplinary teams, we're not really seeing a change in the primary ownership of disclosures, where sustainability teams have largely historically managed those disclosures. We're seeing it still sit there where it's a comms team that manages it. We're still seeing it sit there where it's a legal team that's done it. We're still seeing it sit there. So, we're seeing more people being brought into the process, but we're not seeing, big changes in the primary ownership. So
Yeah.
if folks in the call are worried they're going to get disintermediated from what they do, the answer is you're probably not going to.
Yeah, and we've seen, I would say similar. What we have seen is some groups moving department oversight.
Yeah.
So maybe the team moves underneath legal, maybe the team moves underneath finance. So we have seen that, and their executive sponsor is changing, but that is typically for the better, with more a movement towards rigor around the assurance process.
I think that's right. And then the other thing also where things have moved to finance Finance teams generally just seem to have bigger budgets. And so, I think a lot of people have been very happy with that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's yes, more to be said there. And then I guess as a quick aside, would you based upon your guidance on changing goals or severing goals for that matter, would you follow the same counsel for environmental goals versus social goals?
So is high level, yes, but I think there are some differences. So, environmental goals, not always, but a lot of times they're more quantitative. They're often aligned with third party frameworks. So, science-based targets, for example, whereas with social goals, a lot of those are a lot more individualized by company, and more company specific, so more bespoke. I think, an important difference that we a lot of times see is that the folks who care about changes in environmental goals are different than the folks who care about the changes in social goals. So a lot of the social goals, they relate to workforce within companies. And so I do think how you think about, communicating things, in the social context often requires a little bit different approach than maybe you would take, in the environmental context, because as again, it just oftentimes affects workforce, and so you have to focus on, attracting, motivating, retaining your people, right?
Mhm.
And you don't have to necessarily think about that in quite the same way with a lot of things on the environmental side.
And from what we've seen from reader information, your most interested audience shifts for those particular topics as well. So that is something to consider.
And by the way, employees read things really closely, right? And they will, what we were talking about before, about being clear, and readers will fill in the white space. That's an area in particular, right? I think, if what you're saying is not clear, a lot of employees will assume the worst, right?
Yes, yes, that worst case scenario, Mad Lib, as it were. Um, the one of the questions that we always get, we'll make a recommendation, and usually the rebuttal, and also honestly, our practice is usually to point to a practitioner that has done a good job on that particular topic. And so in this case, are there any companies that you think that have done a good job around, not to put you on the spot here, but have done a good job around articulating and changing goals and how they're thinking about it and how the and ultimately what came of that?
So it's always easy when you ask for good examples rather than bad examples. So no company is perfect on this, and right, every company gets, no matter what you do and how well you do it, you're going to get criticism from
Of
some
course.
constituency that you didn't do it well, you didn't communicate it well. But I think as a general matter, I think that JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon have done a pretty good job on some of this stuff. And I don't know if there's any JPM people on the call today, but I think he was, in particular around a lot of changes to DEI initiatives. I,
Mhm.
I think he was, very kind of forthright and clear around a lot of that, and was very clear, and and indicating that the company's approach to different worker communities and populations wasn't changing, and the company was still committed to a lot of societal commitments, and that really, what he wanted to do was, cut down on wasteful spending, and that there were, things that, JP Morgan and others did that he thought were more about bureaucracy than, really kind of positive change, and that, and the focus was going to be on, kind of the positive stuff, and not, getting rid of all the wasteful stuff. So I just thought it was a very good way of doing it. And, my opinion. Now the other part which you didn't ask me is, well, there've been folks that have done bad job. And I won't call out particular companies, but I will say, look, I think especially around, some of the DEI stuff, it was an area where I think a lot of companies, really stumbled with it. Some handled it better than others. But I think that, with all of this, it's just important that I think disclosures just have to be, genuine, consistent with core values. And, I think, where companies have, flip-flopped a lot or, there's a lot of corporate speak and things, yeah, I think, stakeholders have, generally seen through it, right? So I think the North Star here should always just be, try to be, genuine and clear and, and over the long term, that's gonna, probably, you be the best course for companies.
Yeah, yeah. So we just have a couple of minutes left, and I was hoping that we were going to have time to get to this. I'm glad we are. But in the news from yesterday, a group of 16 U.S. state attorney generals sent letters to leaders of several companies, including Microsoft, Google, and Meta, urging the companies not to comply with CSRD or CSDDD, particularly with warnings that the law would expose the companies to lawsuits and government enforcement actions in the U.S. Thoughts?
So, broad perspective, just stepping back, none of
Yeah,
this is new, right? Right. I mean, so we've
correct.
been seeing, so-called red state AG letters, for, 3+ years now, largely, kind of focused on asset management and financial institutions previously, but, kind of alleging that, engaging in particular practices, would violate the law, and, whether it was antitrust grounds, consumer protection grounds, securities fraud or other things, right? Right. So this is not new. Yeah, I think also, the unhappiness of the US with CSRD and CSDDD is not new, and there's a whole lot of kind of other things kind of going on there. So I would kind of view all of this as just, kind of part of this, kind of bigger, discussion around CSRD and CSDDD. I think for most of the companies on the phone today, the good news is that that letter that you're referring to went out to a fairly small set of companies. But I think, the broader message is, look, I think you always have to kind of think about the broader context here of, you know, um, conflict of laws and complying with US laws and, and then also just, antitrust issues and the like, right? Right. So, and, I think, look, all of these letters always, there's, whether they come from the left, they come from the right, there's always, you know, some sensationalism in them and some
Yep.
performative nature, but certainly I think it's, I'm glad you raised it because I think, even for the companies that didn't get the letter, I think it's, it's important for people to kind of understand these broader dynamics and, be aware of them as kind of part of their communications and, goals and targets and things they said.
Well, and even with the performative nature of it, best case scenario, there's no action. It doesn't mean it's not highly disruptive and
Yep.
doesn't force, hours of additional conversation and bringing in outside counsel and, educating leadership, having leadership. It does make an impact just from that very nature. And that when amplified over the many companies that are concerned over the potential impact of that, it really is an amplified force. And that's really one of it's just another cherry on top. And this so far this Sunday's got lots of cherries. Um,
Right, right. And look, I think all of this was really easy 5 years ago when, it was just about, the more you said, the better. And it seemed
yeah,
like everybody was going to like everything you said. And, this has all gotten very, very nuanced. And, I think just what makes it hard is, companies have a lot of legacy disclosure out there. And, there's just a lot of stuff that has to be reconciled with new disclosure requirements, differing views on, different aspects of sustainability, different requirements and different, like it's certainly much more complex. So like I said, I'm glad you mentioned the letter because I think the takeaway to, folks on this call is you just have to be very sensitive to all of these different views, because you can't like, do this with, with blinders on, because that's, I think, where people tend to get into trouble.
yeah, yeah. I would agree with that. And sustainability is now a team sport more than ever. So,
Yeah,
um,
more than right.
Yeah, we are at time. I can't thank you enough for this conversation. I have very much enjoyed it. I hope those that have stayed on. I mean, there's still 41 people on the call, so it looks like we've done
Right.
something right. Um, Thank you so much for those that sent in their questions. If there are any burning topics that you would like us to discuss on December's client forum, by all means, please feel free to send them. It is most helpful when they're relevant to the largest audience. So, Michael, thank you so very much. We really appreciate you having this conversation with us today, and we will be in touch because the thought piece, we want the world to have better information.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me.
All right, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.